This is a paid advertisement from BetterHelp. Mental health is just as important as physical health, especially in pre-hospital care. Whether you're responding to a call or decompressing after a shift, how you care for your mind directly affects how you show up in the world. So while conversations about mental well-being are becoming more commonplace, there's still a lot of hesitation. A recent study in the UK found that 37% of people feel uncomfortable talking about mental health due to fear of judgment. That stigma can stop people from getting support when they need it the most. So therapy isn't just for times of crisis. It's a place to really learn coping strategies, process the weight of what we witness, and reset when life feels overwhelming. Even small check-ins can make a huge difference in how we show up for ourselves, our teams, and our families. BetterHelp is an online therapy platform that offers access to therapists with a broad range of specialisms. You can connect from wherever you are, whether you've just come off shift or trying to find balance in a busy schedule. And if you've ever thought, maybe I should talk to someone, that moment of awareness is worth listening to. So we're all better with help. As a listener of the Pre-Hospital Care Podcast, you can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/carepod. That's betterhelp.com/carepod. CAREPOD. Please see the show notes for further details. This podcast is sponsored by Pax. Whether on the water, on land, or in the air, Pax bags are both versatile and flexible backpacks that are perfectly suitable for your requirements in the most demanding of environments. Pax bags are highly regarded due to their exceptional performance in pre-hospital and in critical care environments. Their well-organized compartments and customizable configurations enhance efficiency in high-stress situations. They're designed with infection control in mind and are easy to clean and disinfect. So highly visible colours and reflective strips aid quick identification and adherence to quality standards, ensuring reliability. So the versatility of Pax bags caters to diverse EMS providers, and they deliver vital equipment, durability and ease of use for pre-hospital critical care services globally. I've used Pax bags in a number of critical care situations, and they're absolutely excellent, both in identification of kit, but also in identification of the reflective strips to ensure visibility. So please see the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care Podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Okay, so welcome back to the UK Pre-Hospital Care Podcast with me, Lisa Burrell, and I'm joined today by Chris Molyneux. Our people who listen regularly will remember that at the end of 2024, we closed up the year with a sort of reflection, a podcast reflecting on all sorts of things that happened in 2024, but we touched quite a lot on how we process trauma, particularly as critical care paramedics. And that episode just got such a positive response from people. There was so much, so much interaction and engagement with that. It just thought it'd be nice to take that forward. And we're going to settle in a little bit to a conversation today, looking a bit more at a deep dive with Chris around sort of the processing of trauma and a particular approach that Chris brings to us. So welcome, Chris. It's so really genuinely so lovely to have you and have this time to talk with you. Chris, you've spent more than a decade as a counsellor working alongside people who are sort of rediscovering how to frame how their experiences of trauma and how to rediscover their sort of reference points around how things have affected them and how to sort of recenter themselves after that. And you've spent a lot of time supervising other counsellors who do the same. So, it's just so valuable to have your experience, and I'm really looking forward to drawing out some of that and seeing what we can take forward maybe in healthcare from this. So thank you for joining me today, Chris. It's really, really good to have you with us.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. I'm really looking forward to it and seeing where we get to.
Yeah, brilliant. And Chris, one thing that I would say is that, what's lovely about you and the conversations we've had in the build up to this and listening to you talk before is just the authenticity that you bring to this though. So let's settle in and have a good chat around this.
Yeah.
So can we start, Chris, by maybe it'd be just useful for our audience to understand a little bit about who you are, what drew you to counselling maybe in the first place, and why you connect with what it is that you do.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I've been working as a counselor probably for about over 15 years now. And I guess it felt like quite a vocational thing for me. I kind of discovered it as I was doing my degree. I started doing some early stages of counseling training alongside that. And that really kind of piqued my interest and really confirmed to me that that was a route that I want to pursue. So I kind of took a bit of a kind of divergence away from the degree a bit once that had finished and finished my counselling training. And I think it was not only finding a job like counselling and a role like counselling that I really valued, but particularly I discovered the person-centered approach and Carl Rogers. And I think that was the real core of what spoke to me. I think the values that are inherent in that and the way that it approaches people and relationship and therapy just felt like it really aligned with myself. And I think, as we say to our students as well, I think it's really important that if you are practicing an approach, that it is kind of genuine to you, that it isn't something you're putting on or something that you're having to play at. But the more that it is aligned with who you are as a person, I think the better we can do anything, maybe not just therapy. And so for me, it's been this journey of kind of becoming both in myself, but also professionally through that route. Yeah, and that approach is really, really central to me and my work, and I have a lot of value of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I know that you've sort of spoken before about how discovering that particular approach was like a real revelation, like coming
Mm,
home for you, like
yeah.
finding something that really resonated deep inside you.
Mm, mm,
And that's, I guess, why this feels so authentic to talk to you about
mm,
it, because it's not just a theory or something that comes from a textbook, but it's something
yeah.
that you deeply connect with as well, which makes it really nice to talk with
Mm,
you about it, because it doesn't feel
mm,
like just a professional telling you something
mm,
that you
mm.
might find useful. It's actually coming from a very human place, I guess.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think that I value that in myself too. And I think because of part of this approach is about authenticity, not only in the therapist, but also that a lot of the process for clients is becoming more authentic as well. That I do think it's just such a central kind of tenet of the approach. So I think that is really important. And it's lovely that it's picked up and experienced as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and before we get into the
Mm,
person-centered approach and what that all means and
mm,
unpack that a little, maybe just want to draw people in who are listening to this, because
mm.
for years and years and years I've done this job and been exposed to things and thought, well, that's the job, that's what we do.
Mm,
And if
mm,
anyone said to me, how are you, I would just say, oh, I'm fine,
yeah.
and I bounce back and I go back and we carry on. And I might lie awake at home thinking about some of the things I've
Mm,
seen or some of the things I did or some of the things I didn't
yeah.
do. But I would certainly never have been somebody who would cross a line and say, oh, it would be useful for me to talk to a counsellor. That
Yeah.
for me felt like that's something that works for other people,
Yeah.
and I could see that it's useful, but I wouldn't recognize myself within any of that.
Mm,
And I suppose, it's taken me probably more than a decade of working in critical care
mm,
to see just the value of the authenticity of a human conversation from somebody who
mm,
has insight and perspective. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity to share some of
mm,
that feeling with the
mm,
audience who listen to
mm.
this, because not everybody would be willing to cross the line or even recognize in themselves that it would be of any use for them to go and seek any sort of help.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd even say like a step before seeking help is that thing about acknowledging it in yourself. I think, as you were saying, is, particularly if we're working in environments where that is normalized, then it makes it a lot harder to kind of be honest about the impact it has. So to be in a team and an environment that is experiencing trauma daily, there can be a kind of culture, I suppose, of just like, well, this is what we do, this is the job. There's maybe not much room to say that was really difficult for me, because the response sometimes can be, yeah, I know it's difficult for me too, we just get on and go to the next job. So I think there is a real process, as you say, of being able to acknowledge it in ourselves of like, that had a real impact on me and that stayed with me and that is affecting other areas of my life. So yeah, I think there's kind of two stages to that. First, acknowledging it in yourself, and then, like you say, if you're needing further support, that something like counselling might come into the picture then.
Yeah, sure. And there's definitely been times that I've recognized in myself how destructive it can be to normalize just a huge amount of I don't know how to sort of describe it, but maybe like moral injury that we expose ourselves to every time we go to work. That we're coming across tragedy on an immense scale and become very good as a system at normalizing that. And maybe it is really worth stepping back and just saying that's not normal. That's not a normal amount of trauma for a human being to see on a daily basis and to become accustomed to. And maybe we've done some things in our processing to allow ourselves to have, we talk about resilience, to be able to go and do that every day. But it's not normal, and it's really refreshing to have a conversation where the starting point is actually this is not normal. So what do we do with it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's something of almost anything in our lives, whatever it is like, if it is having an impact, or if we're feeling a certain way as a result of it, that is validation enough. It's like there doesn't need to be a kind of external book, for example, to say this is a problem, this isn't a problem. It's like, if I'm affected by something, it could be the tiniest thing, but I'm not choosing that response. So if my body is telling me something, if my emotions are telling me something, psychologically, whatever it is, for me, that is kind of information enough to say this is having an impact. And I guess, like I was saying, in certain environments, there's a risk that that is kind of disregarded in a sense, or it's kind of said, yeah, there isn't space for that, there isn't time for that, which can just increase that likelihood to kind of suppress it, I guess, which actually can make it even more dangerous then as an impact that it has on you.
Yeah, it's powerful actually when you stop and think about it like that. And you and I have talked before about how these cues that you hear from your body or your environment or the people around you, I've heard you describe them as being like the data of your life. And we're very used to looking at data and trends, and that's how we form our medical knowledge and understanding. But it was a really eye-opening concept for me to think about what is the data of my life? What is the feedback that I should be looking at about how I am?
Totally. Yeah.
Can you maybe unpack that for us a little bit, and how you see that?
Yeah, I suppose it's like, in a sense, that is, all those things are giving us information about ourselves. If we thought of a kind of research study, it's almost like, what are the results of this research study? And if we were a research study, it's almost like, what are the results telling me? So, it could be anything from how is my sleep, to how are my relationships, to how are my mood swings, to how is my appetite. It can be literally anything, but it's almost like all of those things are telling us something. And actually, we will nearly always spot those things first. When people first come to counselling, it's very rare that they will come straight away with the kind of core issue, as it were. What they come with is kind of saying, I'm not feeling myself, or I want things to be different, whatever it might be. And that might begin a process then of getting more to what might be causing that. So actually, these kind of symptoms, I guess that's the best word for it, the symptoms we're experiencing are going to be giving us really good insights into maybe deeper processes that are going on and the impact that they're having.
Yeah, it's amazing when you step back actually and look at that. And I've certainly seen this in myself and in colleagues, when I've been talking to people, and there's this sort of uneasiness and they can't quite put their finger on what it is, but they'll be telling me, oh, I'm just not sleeping well. And it won't necessarily be related to a particular case, or you know what, I'm just not enjoying life, or things at home, the relationships around me, things are just not working, and I can't put my finger on a particular case or a particular thing. It's not like I haven't recognized in myself that there's been a trauma that has triggered this that I should go and see somebody about, because we're quite good at following up on a big event. But sometimes there's things going on under the surface, and I think that that's what we're going to get at now, as we sort of take a little walk into the person-centered approach.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. I'll take us through it. I mean, what does it mean, and why does it mean such a game changer, do you think?
Yeah, so for me, I think the thing that makes it stand out so much, probably still, but particularly when it was first introduced around the 1940s and 50s, was that it completely turned therapy on its head. Like, up until that point, I suppose we had kind of Freud and Jung, and it was seen as the therapist is the expert. So, the client comes with their kind of difficulty, their neurosis, whatever it might be, and the therapist is the kind of together individual who is analyzing you and knows best. And then comes in the person-centered approach and Carl Rogers, and he looks at it the complete opposite way. And what he is saying is, what if the client knows best? After all, the client is the only person in the world who lives with themselves 24/7. Like, who could know themselves better than the person themselves? So what he came to was, actually, what our job is as therapists is maybe not to direct or instruct, but actually to create a facilitative environment for the client to find their own way. And I think the real beauty in that is that, as well as having a deep amount of respect for individuals, it also captures the uniqueness of each person. Because if we have a kind of set structure of therapy and treatment, then people are kind of restricted to just that. Whereas in the person-centered approach, if what you're creating is an environment for a person to find their own direction, that allows that outcome to be absolutely anything. And that is what people are. What one person who comes to see me for anxiety would have a completely different outcome and solution to another person who comes to see me for anxiety. And that's because we've had such different lives, such different experiences, different things work for us, different things don't. And so for me, that's why it's so potent, it's so powerful as an approach. And I think, similar to what I was saying at the start, is something about that also kind of aligns with my values, which really helps me practice it as well. I think it's good that there's different approaches to therapy for people, because it isn't a one size fits all. It's just that I can practice this well, and it is helpful to a lot of clients. But it isn't to say it's like the be all and end all, Yeah, and just to say a little bit more about that to help understand it, the kind of main conditions that Rogers pulled out or saw was most important for people is that they are genuinely accepted by the therapist and genuinely understood. And most of our job really is understanding as deeply as we can what an experience is like for someone. So a lot of the kind of process is me trying to really listen deeply and check my understanding with the client. And in a way, that can be therapeutic in itself for a client, is to be heard and to be understood. But I think it also allows them to kind of go to new places because they feel accepted and understood, and so can then share more of themselves. And as we were saying before, usually then become more authentic as a result.
Yeah, it's that word authentic that just stays with me every time we talk, because I think there's some real golden nugget in there somewhere about the role that we play for when we're out with patients. It is always playing a role. That sounds obvious, but what it means is that you experience things and don't necessarily allow yourself to experience the emotions that should be associated with those things, because you're in role. And when you're away from that and you're out of your role, there's something about reconnecting with the authenticness of yourself, isn't it? And your actual emotions again, and allowing yourself to experience something as a result of what you've been through, or what you've been exposed to, or what you've borne witness to. And I know that you've talked about this before when you talk about the tension that people have inside themselves, that sort of psychological tension leading to maybe other problems, and that's one thing that you're helping people unpack a bit within this person-centered approach. How does that all work? How do you feel that comes together?
Yeah. I think it's a kind of natural process that kind of shows itself time and time again in therapy. So I think going back to what I was saying before, rather than it being like a theoretical thing that we put onto clients or direct them through, I think it's just more a kind of capturing of how people operate and why they experience tension. So what Rogers was saying about psychological tension is basically what exists in us all is a kind of self-concept, so how we view ourselves as people. And then we also have all the experiences that we have in life. And what we tend to do is to really just accept and acknowledge the experiences that fit in with the view of ourselves. The problem with that is all the experiences that don't fit in with ourselves, we have to deny or distort. And what he's saying is that the more that we do this, the more psychological tension or anxiety or distress we will feel. So I guess to take an example from before around that is when we were talking about, say, critical care or being at an incident, the more, like you were saying, we can be authentic, even if it's afterwards, because I do understand there's a role you do need to do in that. It's very different to a therapist. It's like some things need to be done in that moment. But the more we can have the authenticity afterwards, the less distress that should create. The difficulty comes when we deny experiences in ourselves, and that can be the impact of an event. It could be trauma. It might even just be a brief exchange with someone. There's a whole range of things it can be. But the less kind of genuine we are with ourselves and our feelings and our experiences, what Rogers is saying is the more tension we will create. So when clients are coming to therapy, what they're usually saying in lots of different ways is, I'm experiencing a great amount of psychological tension. And what the process often happens is that they move to a more authentic place, which then means they're experiencing less psychological tension. And, the client will probably never know those terms or that process in a way. They might just say, oh, I feel better, or I can be myself more, or I feel lighter. But yeah, in the theoretical terms, that kind of psychological tension is how that's summed up.
And where do you think people get this frame of reference from, their sort of rule book of what they can and can't accept, I suppose? Where does that come from?
Yeah, it's a good question. The heart of that really is mostly childhood, I would say. So from our primary caregivers, we are going to get lots and lots and lots of rules about how we should or shouldn't be in the world. Sometimes these are explicitly stated, but often it's very implicit and discreet. So an example I use all the time is that if someone falls down, cuts the knee and starts crying, if you have a parent who, again, either implicitly or explicitly gives a message of stop crying, pull yourself together, don't cry over spilt milk, that type of thing, however that is communicated, we will take that into ourselves, and it will become a rule for us, that I shouldn't overreact, I shouldn't get upset, I shouldn't cry, whatever it might be. And there's probably literally, hundreds, thousands of these messages we're getting as children that we take in. And then basically it's the rule book that we then have that we try and live up to in that view of ourselves, in that self-concept. And so all the experiences that we're having that are outside of that is what causes tension. So if I have that rule book of maybe particularly as a man, you shouldn't cry, then every time I want to cry and I'm suppressing that because of my rule book, I'm causing psychological tension. And there are just an endless amount of those that we have when growing up. And they can look well-meaning as well. So some of them might be work hard, which probably has a lot of benefit from it, but there's also times that we can't do that, or we push ourselves too far because of that rule book. So even if it looks well-meaning, if it's held strongly, then it is probably going to cause psychological tension. And I guess just the last thing I'll say on that is, whilst most of it is while we're growing up, there are so many as adults as well. So what is it to be a woman? What is it to be a man? What is it to be a nurse? What is it to be a professional? What is it to be a student? All of these things come with rule books about how we should exist in society and exist in our roles. And the stronger we hold those, the more we're going to have to deny from our experience, because that is so varied all the time. And what we try and do is fit it into this narrow rule book. And that's what can cause real difficulty.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like I see this all the time. We often see people when they join the new profession, when they join our profession, or they step up a role to a new role, and they're trying to imitate the people who've done that role before them, and they're trying to behave like that person and be like that person, really, and deny themselves to be themselves in that role, but be like somebody else in that role. And then you've got this sort of spiral of people putting up a front of what they think is acceptable in terms of how we should feel, how we should behave, how we should what we should be able to achieve, and what we should be able to do when we're there in the moment, in the heat of the moment.
Absolutely.
And that creates a lot of shoulds, which is another thing that you really nice, clear way of that you've talked about before, of how we see this pressure that we put on ourselves with all these shoulds.
Yes.
Yeah. And you've certainly made me think a lot before about reframing shoulds as coulds or something else, just to reflect the pressure differently.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's so many, sorry.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, there's so many shoulds in society. I think like that rule book there's so many shoulds about how we should behave, and I think there is a balance to strike, which I think I'm still trying to strike, because I can sometimes go the other way, which is just like, no, I can, I'll do what I want. I shouldn't have to live up to any shoulds. And actually, to exist in the world, we probably need some shoulds. So they have a place, but I think the more that we have, the more difficulty it creates, because, as I was saying before, the variety of experience of being human is so vast, but the more shoulds and rules we have, the more that we have to deny of that experience, because it doesn't fit in with all those rules about you should do this that way and you should act that way at this moment, when actually there's so much going on in us, and it's so changeable and it's so unique in every moment. But a lot of the structures in the world aren't set up for that. So the shoulds can be a dangerous thing, I would say.
Yeah, definitely, especially as it's not just about the witnessing somebody else's trauma, but because you have a role within that trauma. One of the hardest things is taking away with you a should. I should have been able to do that thing better, or I should have been able to act quicker, or I should have been able to think of that thing that I didn't think of at the time. And those can be really hard for people to process. So I think that's hugely important, and probably just worth just pausing and thinking, letting that sink in for people, because we do it all the time. We do it in the way that we write policies for people. We do it in the way that we debrief cases with people, and it's tiny. It seems like a tiny detail, but the accumulation of that detail over time is huge, actually, and it does lead, I think, to huge anxieties in people and a sense of not being good enough. And it's something that I think about a lot now. So thank you.
No problem. And I'm glad you said that, actually, because I think the individual shoulds is really important, which I maybe missed in that, actually, because a lot might come out of the structures we live in. But I totally agree with you. And often we can be our own worst enemy. And so we carry so many shoulds with ourselves, and they might not even be spoken out. They may be the shoulds we take home and reflect, like you were saying, on I should have done that different, I should have been quicker, whatever it was. And that can be almost like I'm hesitant to use the word toxic, but something about how cyclical that can be. Because if we get stuck in our head at home on our own, all that happens is that just goes on a cycle, and we just get deeper and deeper into it. So it can be a very kind of I don't know, it can have a real impact on ourselves and how we see ourselves and how we relate to ourselves. I think I've said this before, but just to share it in case it's useful, I know for myself it's not always, but when I kind of spot myself being quite critical towards myself or harsh on myself, I'll often think about, okay, if I saw someone else doing this, how would I respond to that? And for me, that kind of breaks that cycle a little bit, because my compassion is often going to be greater for other people than myself, and I think that's a relatively normal thing on different levels, but that is something that can help me at times, and it might be helpful for the listeners as well, in terms of like, okay, if a colleague came to me and said this happened, how would I respond to that, and what would my response to them be? And I think often it will be quite different to what we're saying to ourselves.
Yeah, totally. And we talk about, being kind to ourselves. It's become a bit of a slogan and a buzz phrase, but there is truth in that, and that's a really lovely way to see it. To think, if somebody had come to me and said, "This is what I'm agonizing over," actually, even just saying it out loud can make you say, "I'm being hard on myself here." And I think, in the pre-hospital critical care world, imposter syndrome, if you can call it that, is rife. It's really high, and it's not always a bad thing. Now, this might be controversial. I've never spoken to you about this before. I don't know. I'm just thinking on my feet a bit here, but we're very reflective people. We're very conscientious people normally. To have got to this stage in our careers, we are people who take things away and think about them, reflect, and move forward. And I've had conversations before with people about, in what context is that positive? Because that has taken us to where we are as the clinicians we are. And then at what point is that negative? Does that voice that's telling you, how can I be better, turn on you at some point and say, you weren't good enough? That's a very difficult balance. And that's the sort of, I guess that's what people sort of call imposter syndrome. But we've talked before about, where does it tip from reflecting on something to ruminating on something? And ruminating has got to be a negative, destructive thing, but reflecting is positive, and they're so closely, they're so similar. So and one has taken us to this place in our career, and the other can really attack us from the inside without us really always being aware of it. So I don't know.
I agree. Yeah, and it's such a, like you say, such a fine line there, is that it can start on that reflecting side and it can tip over as well. And I think I'm just trying to think what the difference might be there. I suppose I think for myself is, what is the attitude that might be underpinning the reflection, if that makes sense. So if it feels a kind of compassionate, gentle, for want of a better word, kind of progressive reflecting, I think that's one way that we can progress and learn from it. But I think when we go into the rumination, then we might get more of that attitude of like, you are bad at your job, you should have done better, how could you have done such a thing? So it's like, if we can spot the attitude maybe that's underpinning the reflection, that also might give us a bit of insight into that and which side of that is falling on, because I agree it can be a fine balance.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think if your reflections are taking you forward, and the end point of your reflections is understanding what you could do next time, then brilliant. But if your reflections are taking you round and round in a circle, and it's becoming a cyclical attack on yourself, something's got to break that cycle, hasn't it? So I guess the next question then, Chris, is how do people make space to acknowledge this tension that might be going on inside themselves? How do people do that?
I suppose it will kind of show up in lots of different ways. So I think the initial part, say for example in counselling, is that people will come with the symptoms of that tension, for example, and I think through the sessions they may have a space to do that. But I'm just thinking I might rewind a little bit and think about in the kind of everyday life of that as well. I suppose going back to what we said earlier about the symptoms, the data we might experience in our life, I think they are the kind of pointers to us of like, okay, why I used to have more patience, I used to have more capacity, why has that changed, and what is that showing me? And then I suppose it's something about being intentional to be able to reflect on that. And that doesn't mean you have to go into some, mountain hillside and reflect for a week or something. It's just saying, let's have 5 minutes to check in with myself and see how I'm feeling about this, and to be honest with myself. Because, as I was saying before, this thing of like, we might have to play the game a lot in life, and we might have to follow these rules. So if this is just a private process, that maybe we can allow ourselves to be really, really honest with ourselves, because we don't have to tell anyone. It's just an internal process. So, so if someone's really annoyed us and we feel unreasonable about that, we don't have to go and tell them straight away, but it is just something to say, I'm really annoyed by that exchange. And I might not know why, it might not seem fair, but I am feeling this regardless. So I think in a way of how people can notice this psychological tension is to be intentional, to have space for yourself, to really be honest about how you feel about things. Kind of no filter is the best way to do that, I think. And other people, some people really value doing that on their own. Other people might just do that with friends. It might just be getting stuff off their chest. It might just be that kind of catharsis of talking things through. And I think, I'd imagine most people can agree that when we've really just let that happen and let ourselves go, we can often feel better for it. We might just finish that saying, oh, God, that feels better just for saying it. I'm just glad that I could say that and acknowledge it. So I think that is the first step, is just to have space wherever that might be. It can be on your own, it can be with friends, it can be with family, it can be in counselling, to just be honest, really. And there won't be any, punishment for it. There's not going to be anything coming back, because it is just a personal, private exploration. And I think the more we can develop our self-awareness, the more chance we have of being honest with ourselves. Because the more we know that's going on in us, the more we can be aware of, and then hopefully kind of accept and be honest with ourselves about that. So I think self-awareness is a big part of that too.
I mean, I just think these things are so important, and I really wish somebody had told me all of this when I started, because if I could share anything with my colleagues who are joining the profession now, this would be it. I think, they get told all the time, be a bit more this, be a bit more that, change your personality for the role, be louder, be more confident, be whatever it is that people tell them to be. And people can't change their personalities, they have to do the role as the person that they are and grow into the role and do it their way. And that has to be okay. Otherwise, people always carry around this tension of inauthenticity inside them and not really be able to process their experiences properly. And I do think that this contributes to burnout and people leaving the profession early and all of these things. We probably don't have time to get into all of that today, but I think it's so important. And I do think that this is the message that people need to hear. If they're really going to do the job and be okay, and keep doing the job and stick it out, sort of thing, and it be a healthy thing for them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think both. What I'm thinking as you're saying that is both individually for like the care of the individual, but I also think about how wonderful and important it is to have a varied workforce. Like if there is a certain role or personality, it's like kind of homogenous in a way. Then it's like everyone's the same, but actually how wonderful that you have some nurses and doctors that have a different disposition than others, and that's going to work differently with different patients. And so I think variety is also important. So as well as the individual well-being, I think it's something about what we offer in our roles as well. And the importance of difference in that as well.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that more and more we're moving towards being able to embrace that. Previously, everybody sort of imitated the person who'd gone before them and tried to be like them. We ended up with lots of little medical mimics, and everybody was, becoming a mold of somebody else. And that's not right. And diversifying the workforce has been one of the best things. And to be able to see that you can bring different things through different personality types into the team and into the thinking, I think it's really powerful, actually. And the more we adapt and adjust to that, the better, because, the system's been very rigid and asked people to flex to the system for a very long time. But it's really important to support people properly, that we don't ask them to be more resilient and more flexible and more moldable, but the system can be,
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Chris, I'm very aware that this will be resonating with some people, and maybe in a new way that they haven't seen in themselves before. And I know it certainly did with me. So I know that there will be people who'll be thinking, I've never really understood myself within this whole context in this way before, and just slightly adjusting my frame of reference. And some people will just take away a bit more self-reflection from it, a bit more awareness. But for some people, they might actually be wanting to reach out for help. Do you have any advice on how to do that? What would be the best way? Is there a wrong way? Is there a right way? I don't know.
I think the very first thing I would say, and I'll say a bit about finding counsellors later, but before that is just go and try as many counsellors as you like to find the right fit, because there are literally thousands of counsellors on offer. And the one thing that research continues to show is that the quality of relationship is one of the most important factors in the success of therapy. And so being able to find a good fit for you, I think very similar to what we were saying before about diversity, that is very much the case within therapy. Especially talking around that idea of authenticity, is that everyone's authentic therapist is going to be very, very different. And within that as well, there are different approaches to therapy too. I'm just trying to think how much to say about that, because that could be a whole podcast in itself, is to talk about the different approaches. But the first thing I'd say is have initial sessions with lots of people. They aren't always, but they can tend to be free. And even if counsellors don't do free initial sessions, you could always just have a kind of 15-minute phone call, so you get an idea of who and how they are, and also can say a bit about what you're looking for, and then see if you're a good fit together. So I would do that until you feel fairly confident. And there might still be some discomfort, there might still be some nerves, but it's more about the therapists themselves. If you feel like you trust them, if you feel like you can share things with them and it's a good fit, then I'd say that's the first thing. In terms of looking therapists, so there's different ways. A lot of people will have their own private websites if they work in private practice. So that might just be found through a kind of Google search of putting in counsellor and then the location you're in. But there are also directories, like BACP have a directory to find a therapist. There's other ones like Counselling Directory as well, where you can equally put in your location, but you could also put in the issues that you're wanting to talk about. And you'll get a long list of therapists. And even that, just seeing someone's picture and seeing how they describe themselves, I think can give you a good insight into who they are, which will help hopefully kind of narrow it down as well. I think as well as using those resources, the main thing is like finding the right fit. There's so many avenues I could go into there, but I don't know if there's anything else that would be helpful or anything missing in that as a brief overview, at least.
No, I think it's great. And I think it opens up our thinking about what taking those steps might mean, because often you sort of think, you'll maybe tell your employer that you need some help, and then you'll get referred to somebody within the trust, or, it seems like quite a fixed process, but it's interesting to think about it as got to be, the dynamic has to be right for it to work.
Absolutely.
And that sort of dialogue, feeling that you get in that dialogue has to be right. That's
completely.
very special.
Yeah. And I also think, part of, good therapeutic practice is that within the first session, alongside the kind of contracting, is that the therapist should be asking you what you're looking for and what you're wanting to get out of therapy. And they should also be explaining how they work as a therapist. I think that's really important. I would say not everyone does that, but I think, look and hopefully experience that from a therapist, and really be honest about, what you're looking for, and really kind of grill the therapist if you want to. Do you know what I mean? You are the customer in a sense, and you have endless choice of people. So, be asking them what they know about what you're wanting to talk about, or how aware they are of, if you're talking about, critical care or working in the NHS, whatever it might be. And it's not that they need to be an expert on every area you're going to explore, but it's just getting a sense of, like, how does this person relate to this thing I'm talking about? How well are they going to meet my needs or not? And I think it's absolutely within your right to be sure about those things, and ask those questions. And any good therapist should be encouraging of that and facilitative of answering those questions honestly, and being upfront about all that too.
Love it. I think that, when you were talking about going up a mountain and having a proper retreat, I would definitely like that. But just the thought of reaching out to somebody, it's a special thing, and maybe an essential thing. And you've made me reflect a lot as I think about what the future might look like for our world. I do think that this has to be a fundamental part of it. There's been a lot of silence over people's well-being, and a lot of it's hidden and not well understood, and people don't connect with it, aren't aware of it, don't stop and pause and acknowledge it in themselves, and can go through a whole career without ever really acknowledging some of this. So I guess if I had, just thinking about my reflections as we bring our conversation in, if I had a vision for what the future might look like, I'd love to have somebody with your perspective helping us to see this in context. Every time we're discussing and debriefing a case, when we're doing our case reviews, to have somebody with a mindful eye on how were you. And that, I'm not saying on every case, because that would probably end up being a bit of a token gesture, but somebody picking up some of this, and just making people aware, just keeping it on people's radar. This isn't normal, what you've been exposed to.
Totally.
And the tension inside you about how you might be processing it, might just need to talk it out. So,
absolutely. And just to say very briefly around, I think about supervision with things like that. So in therapy, there is a requirement to have supervision every month. And I would say that critical care is dealing with a lot more trauma on a lot more regular basis, and there isn't a requirement for supervision. So for me, that is another area that could be really beneficial, is that supervision is integrated more into helping professions, because we need those places to explore the impact of work. And so I guess the difference with that and counselling is kind of very personal and can be anything from work and anything else. Supervision can often be a lot more work focused, is like, how is my work going? How's it affecting me? Ideally with someone who has a good idea of that context as well. But I think something like that's really important.
Chris, I honestly couldn't agree with you more. I think when we have our debriefs, so remote supervision, if you like, the case debriefs away, it's actually, unless it's been a big case, it's not that common to bring in a welfare aspect into the discussion, but it might be hugely relevant for that individual. And I love how you've talked about individuals all the way through this. And then when that's sort of a remote supervision of our clinical practice, but when somebody's on scene doing face-to-face supervision with somebody, and I don't know people's systems and how often people get the experience of that, but it is exactly like you say, often about how's their clinical practice, what's their technical skills like, what's their patient interaction like, but not about them and how they are. Absolutely. And I hugely believe that, that a big part of that shift or that time should be spent checking in and mentoring that person's well-being as much as we're mentoring their professional development. So
absolutely, totally agree.
That's so lovely to bring that in. I love what you've said about diversity. I love what you've said about supervision. I love what you've said about authenticity. There's been so many takeaways for me. And I guess my last question for you would just be, what are your sort of final reflections as we bring it all together? What would be your key messages, your key takeaways for us?
Yeah, I think maybe the main thing that covers it all is, like, you have a right to feel whatever you feel, and you feel whatever you feel for a good reason, whatever that might be. So I think the more we can allow ourselves that, I think the better we'll do generally, is that, as we've been saying, a lot of the difficulty can be from, trying to suppress or deny the things that we're experiencing. And, more often than not, you hardly ever choose your feelings, so it's like, if you are angry for a reason, and that's okay. And as we've said previously, there may be a process of working out why that is, but, I guess just to validate ourselves more, and validate our feelings and our processes, and have a bit more compassion for ourselves.
Chris, that's amazing. What a lovely message to bring it all in on. And I hope that people will sort of switch off from this podcast and just take a few moments to check in with themselves.
That would be great.
Powerful time. Chris, thank you so much for joining us on the Pre-Hospital Care podcast. It's been a great discussion with you today. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say, just in case it's useful for people, is if they want to dive deeper into this stuff, they can on the Chris the Counsellor on YouTube is where I explore the theoretical aspects of this that might be helpful. And I think that might be the first talk you saw that led us to this as well. So it feels like full circle. So I just wanted to share that, because obviously we've had to touch on different areas, and if people want to understand things deeper or get in touch, I'd be more than happy for them to. So I just wanted to mention that.
Perfect. And we'll share the links to that, Chris the Counsellor, in the show notes. So do click on that and go on a little journey of discovery for yourself. I hope you all enjoyed listening to the conversation I've had with Chris today. I've massively enjoyed it. And thank you so much, Chris, for your time.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. It's been lovely. Really enjoyed it.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.